He stood tall in the center of the chamber, wrists bound, the only human in a room full of silent, watching figures. Cold lights overhead gleamed off polished obsidian floors. No sound, save for the occasional flicker of holographic displays showing Earth's territories, now highlighted in red. He was calm. That unsettled them. A voice, distorted and mechanical, echoed across the circular room. Charges were read in multiple languages, none of them human. Words like insubordination, aggression, and defiance carried equal weight, but none matched the weight of the truth. The captain had refused to kneel, refused to surrender Earth's outpost at Vega, refused to acknowledge the Galactic Empire's claim over humanity. He didn't speak during the proceedings, not until they asked him for final words. He lifted his head, gaze steady, scanning the tiered rows of alien observers. His voice, though low, reached every ear. You think you've won. That by ending me, you silence us. But we are not one. We are many. And we remember, there was no ceremony to the execution, no drawn-out ritual or pretense of mercy. A flash of energy, a dull thud, and then silence. His body hit the floor with the weight of a war that had just begun. In the control rooms on Earth and its colonies, the broadcast ended abruptly. No warning. Screens went black as if in mourning. For a moment, there was stillness. Then the news spread. Across orbital platforms, deep-sea arcologies, Martian domes, and lunar bunkers. In silence, people gathered. Engineers paused their work. Soldiers stood at attention. Civilians froze mid-task. 10 minutes of global silence. Then orders started moving. Encrypted, deliberate, unstoppable. The fleet admiral removed his rank insignia and replaced it with the captain's bloodstained patch. Not a word was said. The gesture spread. Manufacturing lines reconfigured in under an hour. Civilian freighters were stripped and retrofitted into warships. AI cores previously barred from strategic use were awakened with new directives. Across the Sol system, activity surged, not chaotic but focused. Plans that had once been buried under diplomatic layers were resurrected. Projects marked last resort were authorized. No faces, no speeches, just motion. On Titan, a technician assembled fusion cells while replaying the captain's final words on loop. On Phobos, children volunteered for training programs they had no business joining. No one stopped them. No one said it was too much. He hadn't been a hero when he left. Just a man. A naval officer with strong convictions and a stubborn streak. But the Empire had made him something else. Martyrdom had always been a dangerous thing to give to humans. The Galactic Empire had executed a captain. In doing so, they had killed the last thread holding back humanity's restraint. Inside hidden vaults, Earth's forgotten weapons were reactivated. Technologies once deemed too dangerous were reassessed, not with fear, but with purpose. Humanity had never claimed to be the strongest. They'd never had the biggest fleets or the most advanced tech. What they had was memory, rage, adaptability, and a promise not to forget. In secret bunkers beneath the ice caps, commanders gathered around digital war tables. No tears, no grand gestures, just one unified decision. There would be a reckoning. No broadcasts were sent, no declaration made. But all across the stars, those who had once dismissed humans as fractured, chaotic, emotional, felt a shift. Something fundamental had changed. An empire had made an example, and the example had become a spark. That night, under artificial stars, a message was engraved on the outer hull of the flagship rising from Earth's gravity well. For the one you took, for the many who stand. Humanity had grieved. Now it would fight. On every colony, outpost, and ship bearing Earth's flag, the reaction was the same. Movement. No outcry. No mourning speeches. Just the sharp pivot of a species that had seen enough. Factories once dedicated to peaceful expansion retooled their lines in silence. Civilian transport yards shifted schedules and cargo. What once moved food and medicine now carried armor plating and weapon cores. The council met in a secure orbital station, representatives from every nation, faction, and settlement. They didn't argue over what had happened. Everyone saw the execution. The question was what came next. Some spoke of restraint, measured response, tactical diplomacy. Others brought up Earth's long history of conflict, how restraint was a luxury rarely granted and never respected by empires. A vote was taken, and, for the first time in human history, it was unanimous. The declaration was not public. Humanity wouldn't waste time on grandstanding. The mission was clear: dismantle the Empire's claim to supremacy and eliminate any force that dared make a martyr of a human. Operations began before the meeting ended. Old assets were reactivated. Sleeper agents embedded in border systems. Black-budget AIs sealed beneath lunar rock. Ships with serial numbers erased decades ago. They weren't weapons of conquest. They were tools of precision, instruments designed to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast. On Earth, deep in Arctic bunkers, engineers unlocked prototypes previously deemed too unstable. One by one, lines of forbidden tech were pulled into production. Zero-gravity kinetic launchers, cloaked drones with adaptive learning, hulls grown from reactive smart alloys that could heal mid-battle. Mars offered its innovation. The colonies had spent decades in harsh conditions, developing tech out of necessity. Now that ingenuity was weaponized, fighters powered by pulse-harvested energy, modular ships built in weeks instead of years, stealth armor tuned to fool both sensors and psionic scanners. Everything was tested in real-time simulations, then rushed to the front. Not just tools, but minds were mobilized. Linguists worked to intercept and decrypt Empire transmissions. Behavioral scientists mapped alien decision-making patterns. Psychologists profiled commanders based on public footage and speeches. Every scrap of information became a thread in a vast net of understanding. Human adaptability, their ability to learn and evolve under pressure, became the war's greatest weapon. Across the network, a phrase spread. Not from a broadcast, not ordered, but repeated naturally. Remember the captain. It became a code, a signal, a moral anchor. Not for revenge, for resolve. In the asteroid belts, shipyards accelerated. Orbital rings lit up as frames took shape faster than anyone thought possible. Automation handled volume, but it was still humans who fine-tuned the final details. A technician didn't need to see the captain die again. She could still hear his words. That was enough. Medical teams developed field protocols for injuries caused by exotic alien weapons. Doctors trained combat medics with old war footage, adapting treatments for conditions no human had ever encountered. Recovery times shortened. Mortality rates dropped. Suffering was minimized, not out of compassion for the Empire's soldiers, but out of respect for their own. Propaganda was never needed. Humanity didn't fight to conquer. It fought because one of theirs was executed as an example. And humans had never been a species that took well to being made an example of. Quietly, they reached out to the fringe species, those under the Empire's heel, those who lacked the strength to rebel. Messages encoded in mathematics and shared pain were delivered. Most didn't respond. A few did, enough to matter. Plans formed. No single target, no suicidal charge at the Imperial core. That wasn't the human way. Instead, surgical strikes were prepared, ones that would hit vital systems. Comm relays, logistics depots, fleet refueling stations. Not just to cripple, but to humiliate. To show the Empire that humans didn't need numbers to fight. They just needed purpose. Commanders worked without sleep. Schedules collapsed into urgency. Simulations ran in parallel. Entire fleets coordinated with shared AI cores. But at the center, always, was human decision. Cold, calculated, relentless. The war wouldn't be fought in anger. It would be fought with precision, with patience, and with fury honed to a needlepoint. Strategic Command set a single directive for every battle group. Engage, disable, vanish. Leave only confusion. Show them fear. Not in death, but in unpredictability. Specialized teams trained for boarding actions, infiltration, cyber warfare. They memorized alien hierarchies, chain of command structures, station schematics. They trained in zero-G environments, learned the physics of alien ships, prepared countermeasures for technologies they'd never used before. There would be no second chances. There didn't need to be. Every day brought the memory of the execution back, not as pain, but as fuel. Humanity's grief had crystallized into resolve. The Empire had tried to break them by taking one. Instead, it had given them a cause worth everything. No speeches, no banners, just progress. Relentless, unstoppable, unified. And through it all, a shared understanding passed through every soldier, every scientist, every citizen. The captain had stood alone. They would not. The Empire didn't expect the first blow to land where it did. A remote relay hub orbiting a gas giant, vital for long-range fleet communication, was reduced to silence in under 7 minutes. No warning, no demand. One moment, it functioned as the core of a regional command net. The next, it was space dust. The Empire's response time was slow, not because they lacked resources, but because they couldn't accept that it had happened. Human vessels weren't seen. Only traces were found. Unusual gravitational distortions, residual burn trails that defied standard propulsion profiles, fragments of metal laced with isotopes unknown to Imperial analysts. That was the message. Not just power, but mastery of the invisible. The Empire launched patrols. Fleets mobilized. Threat assessments were updated. They still assumed it was isolated. A rebellion, perhaps. Localized defiance. They didn't yet understand they were dealing with a species that had already made its decision. Humanity struck again. This time, a resource pipeline near the Selnari cluster. Automated defense grids, neutralized in milliseconds, their own control systems turned against them. Imperial mining rigs went dark, stripped clean, their power cores detonated in sequence to mimic system failure. Each loss was surgical. Each strike left behind a signature. Nothing human, just void. The Empire's doctrine relied on overwhelming response. But how do you strike back when there's no one to hit? Human fleets didn't hold territory. They didn't claim worlds. They disrupted. They disappeared. An Imperial task force pursued one such human assault group near the edge of an uncharted nebula. They were baited with false signals, holographic decoys, and falsified energy signatures. By the time the Empire realized the trap, their ships had been drawn into a gravitational sinkhole. There, humanity's new kinetic payloads activated. Non-explosive, non-nuclear. Simple rods of dense alloy accelerated to a fraction of light speed using slingshot mechanics. No energy trail, no heat signature, just impact. Ships crumpled like paper under the pressure. A transmission followed. Audio only. 3 words, message not received. Empire analysts scrambled to understand. How had the humans managed to miniaturize such gravitational tools? How had they mapped those vectors so precisely? The truth was, they hadn't waited to perfect the tech. They'd accepted failure, studied it, improved faster than the Empire believed possible. Trial by fire was something humans didn't fear. They evolved through it. On the outer colonies, Imperial governors began reporting dissent. Supplies weren't arriving. Trade lanes were unreliable. Empire's support vessels went missing without explanation. Rumors spread of human interference, of rebel sympathizers emboldened by the chaos. The Empire dismissed it as paranoia. They didn't realize how far the narrative had shifted. Alien commanders began filing psychological evaluations of their own troops. Some refused deployment near human activity zones. Not out of cowardice, but superstition. They spoke of shadows that moved like thoughts, of attacks without sound, of systems failing without cause. No explanation satisfied them. Human cyber warfare units took advantage of that fear. They didn't just hack. They reprogrammed. Entire simulation modules used in Imperial training were subtly altered. Slightly wrong star maps, false navigational data, targeting errors that wouldn't be noticed for weeks. The Empire's own infrastructure became a weapon against itself. Then came the ship captures. Small patrol vessels, seemingly untouched, found adrift. Crews missing. No signs of violence. Systems disabled. The hulls bore only a single phrase etched into the alloy. he was one of us. Empire leadership called for retaliation. Massive fleets were dispatched. But every time, the same pattern repeated. They arrived to find silence or destruction already complete. Their frustration grew. So did their recklessness. On the edge of a red dwarf system, humanity laid its most complex trap yet. A decoy installation leaked encrypted transmissions. The Empire sent a vanguard to investigate. As predicted, they brought a full support fleet. They didn't notice the shift in mass along their periphery. They didn't question the timing of solar flares. They didn't realize that every sensor reading they received had been altered at the source. The trap snapped shut. Human vessels emerged not from hyperspace, but from within the gravity well itself, previously believed impossible due to structural stress. Ships designed with flexible molecular frames, piloted by neural interface crews, moved in ways alien vessels couldn't track. Not faster, smarter. And when the engagement began, it wasn't a fight. It was a demonstration. The Empire's loss ratio climbed. Then, as quickly as it began, the attack stopped. Silence. No follow-up. No broadcasts. Just absence. Across the galaxy, military analysts, mercantile houses, and fringe worlds began to draw their own conclusions. The Empire wasn't untouchable. Its doctrine wasn't infallible. A single execution had awakened something it couldn't suppress with force. And then came the signal, this time across multiple open channels, translated into every known galactic language. You executed a man to make a point. Now we return the favor. Every loss you suffer is a question asked across the stars. How long until it's you? Humanity didn't need to conquer. They only needed to remind the galaxy of a truth long forgotten. There are limits, even for empires. The Empire began to fracture, not from outside pressure alone, but from within. High-ranking officials blamed each other. Fleet admirals questioned intelligence briefings. Governors demanded reinforcements that never came. Trust, once absolute among the ruling elite, eroded under the weight of uncertainty. The humans hadn't just attacked ships and stations. They had destabilized perception itself. Reputation, once the Empire's greatest deterrent, no longer held weight. Systems once loyal began withholding tribute. Trade factions stopped honoring monopolies. Independent worlds, once fearful of retribution, started forming quiet alliances behind closed doors. Not with Earth directly, but with the idea it represented, resistance with consequences. Still, the Empire couldn't publicly admit the extent of the problem. To do so would be to confirm human success. So they issued tighter controls, harsher penalties, mandatory surveillance in disputed regions. These measures only accelerated collapse. Every act of desperation became propaganda for humanity without them needing to lift a finger. Meanwhile, human strategy shifted. They no longer struck at military targets alone. They went after memory, data archives, cultural monuments, historical records that propped up the Empire's narrative of superiority. In one operation, they corrupted a planetary museum's central database, rewriting its records to depict humanity not as a primitive species, but as ancient enemies, long buried by false Empire myths. The panic this created within academic circles was greater than any battle. Behind enemy lines, human operatives helped stir rebellion, not with speeches, but with precision disruption. Energy shortages timed with food ration delays, subtle manipulation of environmental controls, whisper campaigns using hijacked Imperial communication nodes. Civilians didn't see soldiers, they saw opportunity. And fear of the Empire turned into quiet contempt. Inside the highest levels of Imperial command, paranoia took root. Advisors were replaced. Internal purges began. Whispers of human infiltration spread, many false, but it didn't matter. The damage was in the fear. Every loyalist questioned whether their neighbor was compromised. Loyalty became a liability. Earth never claimed territory. They offered no terms. Their silence became more damning than threats. Diplomats from neutral worlds pleaded for contact, desperate to understand humanity's endgame. There was no response. The silence spoke for itself. Imperial forces began to fracture further. Entire fleets refused to deploy into human-affected regions. Captains fabricated excuses. Logistics officers rerouted convoys out of self-preservation. The cost of appearing weak became preferable to being a target. Morale plummeted. In one of the core sectors, a prominent Imperial general publicly resigned, citing a fundamental misunderstanding of the human threat. His words spread like wildfire. He wasn't executed. He was silenced, quietly removed from history. But his speech lived on, passed peer-to-peer, encrypted and stored in 1,000 data vaults. A single line from it became a whisper among Imperial youth. They do not conquer. They end. That was the shift. The Empire realized it wasn't facing an invasion. It was facing a correction. A species that didn't seek glory, didn't demand tribute, didn't want territory, only to erase the idea that anyone could execute one of their own without consequence. That idea alone became an existential threat. Back on Earth, there were no parades, no declarations of victory. The war had never been about winning. It had been about remembering. The captain had become a symbol, not of loss, but of the line that must never be crossed again. Humanity began to scale back its operations, not out of mercy, but because the lesson had taken root. Where once the Empire had been feared, now it was doubted. Where it had inspired obedience, it now provoked hesitation. The flow of power had changed direction. Some factions called for continued offense, to finish what had been started. But cooler heads prevailed. Humanity's strength had never been in dominance. It was in restraint. The message had been delivered in full, and those who had listened would carry it forward longer than any occupation ever could. Across the outer systems, observers recorded the absence of human ships where once they had been active. Imperial patrols cautiously returned, only to find abandoned war zones, stripped clean. The silence that followed was not comforting. It was judgment. In the final analysis, the Empire remained intact, but transformed. Its edges frayed, its voice quieter, its posture no longer absolute. Every new decision was now filtered through the same unspoken question. Will this bring them back? And Earth, distant but ever-present, watched. Not as conquerors, as witnesses. Because humanity didn't need to rule the stars. They only needed the stars to remember.